Roshi, my dear friend. Really good to be with you and with all the folks at Upaya who I miss seeing face to face, but hope to one day soon. So very happy to be with everyone this evening. I wanted to start by talking about my son, who's a grown man now, but when he was little, he used to be afraid of monsters in the closets. And I remember one night coming into his room, about to turn off the light, and he said, "Don't turn off the light, Dad." And I said, "Why? What's the matter?" She said, "They're here." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Monsters." And so I could have said, "Don't be silly, go to sleep, turn out the light." But instead I leapt into his bed and we pulled the covers up over our heads. And I said, "Where are they? Where are they?" And he said, "There in the closet." So I said, "Well, we better stay here in the bed then." So we hid under the covers for a while. And after a while I said, "Should we go see if they're still there? What do you think?" I said, "Are you brave enough to try it?" And he said, "Yeah." And then we got down on the floor and we crawled, hand over hand, to get to the closet. And I said, "Bring a pillow, bring a pillow." He got one of the pillows from the bed. And I said, "When I open the door, you toss in that pillow and, see if we can get the monsters." And so I counted 1, 2, 3. I opened the door and he threw in the pillow and there was tremendous chaos, everything falling down, all his toys and stuff in his closet, And we shut the door and I said, "Should we look?" I opened the door and looked, and sure enough, there were no monsters in the closet, And I think, it turns out we're not so different as grown-ups, actually. The monsters we face often feel bigger and uglier than the ones that were living in our childhood closets. But, sometimes, like my son, Gabe, our fears boil down to the stories we tell ourselves. So I get scared all the time. How about you? Don't you get scared? I do. I think the willingness to sit with fear is an act of courage. And so tonight I want to explore with you courageous presence. In fact, I want to talk about 3 types of courage, actually, that we need, actually, as activists, as people who face death. We need this in order to discover freedom and to move toward complete openness. So what's courageous presence look like? Well, for Tracy, a woman I knew, it's sitting at the bedside of her dying mother, being torn apart by both grief and love as she sat there with her newborn infant on her lap, knowing that her mother would never really come to know her child. And for Jackson, another man I knew, it was going to a maximum security prison to sit face to face with the man who'd murdered his mother. And for Terry, a man who used to come to my retreats, it was allowing his body to tremble and shake for 3 days while the contraction of old sexual traumas were released during a meditation retreat. Courage is the heart's answer when fear speaks. The old texts, they refer to the great and courageous bodhisattvas. And these are beings who have the fortitude to stand with suffering that might bring the rest of us to our knees. And it's not that these beings have no fear. Rather, they can maintain courageous presence while they're afraid. They open to fear. They're willing to hold it, to learn from it, to be transformed by it. And in this way, I think, at least in my life, fear serves as a kind of catalyst, a doorway to compassion, a pathway to transformation. So ordinary people like you and I, we put courageous presence into practice every day. Like there was this really brave man, Julio, that I knew, and he was a kind of nurse's aide in a big, major metropolitan city hospital. And he had a heart of gold, this guy, just great. And one of his jobs was to go in and clean up the room after a code had been called, and a code is pretty messy, people's chests are often split open. There's, all kinds of chaos in the room. And after the code, everybody leaves the room and Julio comes in. And his job is to clean the room and to move the patient to the morgue. And so he goes up to the patient and he bows. And he says, he whispers in their ear, "You've died, but it's okay. I'm going to wash away all dust and confusion." And so then he sets about moving around the room and cleaning up the trays and the carts and the sponges, the bloody sponges that are on the floor. And then he starts bathing this person who's died. And inevitably, some nursing supervisor sticks their head in the room and says, "We need the room, hurry up." But the other nurses on the floor, they know Julio and they know what he's doing and they know he's doing sacred work and they cover for him actually. And they make space for him so he can continue to do his work, Julio said to me that he believed that everybody needed loving and personal care. That was his job on the planet. As activists, as people who follow their conscience when we see injustice, life often requires courage of us and a willingness to risk and break the rules. And you can't have justice without truth. And justice requires that we act based on that truth. But spiritual ideas and convictions and patience, they're not enough. Action's required. They say that the great Christian saint and scholar Thomas Aquinas was apparently he very regularly complained bitterly about the fact that the virtue of anger remains unnamed. Now, I'm not suggesting, nor was Aquinas, I don't think, that we should act out our anger or to harm others with it, but I'm saying that it's important for us to get familiar with it, to get to know it, to investigate it deeply, to become intimate with it. And I think when we do, what we often discover is a kind of innate strength which is tangled up in the anger. It's the strength we need to act and to persevere. And it's hidden in the anger. Ultimately, we don't need the anger, but we need the strength. Now, I'm not talking about physical strength here. I'm speaking about the innate, essential strength of our being. The strength and courage that lives in each of us, really. And is sometimes needed, I think, to raise ourselves up from our individualistic, our separate and materialistic existence. In my experience, courage reveals what we care about. I mean, when you read about or witness an act of courage, you know immediately what matters most, what's fundamentally important to the courageous actor. So I think of courage as a kind of essential quality of our Buddha nature. Physical bravery gets all the attention, gets all the news. But courage takes a lot of other forms. We have moral courage and intellectual and emotional courage, psychological, political courage, social courage. I mean, in a simple way, we exercise courage when we simply express ideas that don't align themselves with the majority opinion. Or when we are willing to face the hostility and the ridicule that may accompany, departing from social norms or going against the grain. Fear is part of the equation. If there's no fear, there's no need for courage. Courage breeds fearlessness. And in my mind, at least, fearlessness isn't about eliminating or ignoring or pushing away or, our fear. It's about developing the capacity to be with it, to be with powerful states of mind and heart, even when we're facing terror. Like Tatiana Vivine, she braves violence every day in the Central American Republic, when she goes in to help vulnerable girls and women who are being raped and abused. Or Berta Caceres, an activist and organizer in Honduras, who won the Goldman Environmental Prize for grassroots environmentalism in Central America and South America. And when she was receiving the award in San Francisco, she spoke about her people, the Lenaca, and how they're battling to protect their land, And she talked about how the world must break free of the grasp of capitalism and racism and patriarchy, which lead to self and planetary devastation, destruction. And less than a year later, a man broke into her house in the middle of the night and murdered her in cold blood. There's Gilo Cordoba, also from Honduras, who's challenging those who murder and abuse transgender people because she says she loves her community. And Alicia Garcia, founder of the Black Lives Movement, whose mother died at Zen Hospice, she's been this incredible advocate for reproductive health rights and domestic workers and taking stands against police brutality and racism. But I also know that she's very human. And she's not the person you would imagine to be a hero, actually, but she is. These courageous people, they take a moral stand and at times they risk their own lives doing it. And they're often motivated not just by a sense of purpose, which we understand, but I think also by a deep sense of love and belonging. That's important to understand in our activism, a deep sense of love and belonging. It's like Lao Tzu said, being loved gives you strength, but loving deeply makes you brave. And he said, caring comes from courage. Or like my friend Mark Coleman, the environmentalist, says, we protect what we love. But maybe these people that I'm talking about, these examples I'm giving you sound too spectacular or too far out of reach for our everyday lives. So I thought I'd also include the words of an artist and writer, Marianne Radmacher. And she wrote, courage does not always roar. She said, sometimes courage is like a little voice at the end of the day that says, I'll try again tomorrow. So I wanted to try and just explore 3 types of courage that I see and that I think we need to be familiar with if we're going to be socially engaged activists. And the first of those we're most familiar with, which is the courage of the warrior, right? We think of the contemporary soldier or the first responder. Those are the first ones to come to mind. Soldiers whose training and beliefs and sometimes their adrenaline enable them to override their fear. And we see the same kind of training, by the way, those of us who work in healthcare, where clinicians are trained to overcome fear or push past their normal physical limitations, like needing more sleep or to pee when the urge comes. So healthy warrior courage is motivated by honor, by loyalty, by a relationship to comrades and colleagues, or it's motivated by service or by commitment. Healthy warrior courage is balanced with intelligence in its application. And we feel this courage in our belly. But there's also a shadow side to this kind of warrior courage, because it can be aroused by shame and coercion and the need to control or the desire for approval, or it leads to defensiveness or sometimes a false sense of invulnerability. We should be clear here that bravery doesn't always involve virtuous action. It can be violent and materialistic and militaristic and pretty macho. Speaking for myself more personally, I don't think so much about overcoming fear. I think about coming to know fear in an ongoing kind of dynamic process that I don't think ever will be completed. Having the courage to meet our fear with some degree of balance instead of reactivity gives rise to courage, to the which in the beginning is essential, right? It's essential to making purposeful change. Oh, there's something I wanted to read you, but I don't know if I can find it. Hold on. No, I've misplaced it now. But I'll come back to it later, but I'll tell you the story. Um, it's written, it was an article that appeared in the New Yorker by a writer who was watching a video of a scene in Baghdad where the American soldiers were sent on a mission. And in the neighborhood where they were sent, there was a huge, very famous mosque. And the people were pouring out of the mosque. And they saw the soldiers coming, and they saw the soldiers' presence there as, a threat. And so they came swarming onto this small group of soldiers. And the lieutenant colonel who was guiding this group, Lieutenant Colonel Chris Hughes was his name, he did an amazing thing. He told all his men to kneel and to take their rifles and point them at the ground. It was almost biblical, this gesture that he made, And he told them to smile. And what happened is that the crowd, which was lunging toward them, stopped. And they dispersed and they went home. Anyway, this journalist looked up this Lieutenant Colonel Chris Hughes and found him somewhere in the Midwest of the United States. And he came to interview him. And he said, how did you know how to do that? How did you know how to make that gesture to disperse the crowd? Who taught you that? And the Lieutenant Colonel said, no one taught me that. He said, I was taught, the way to disperse crowds is with, bringing a helicopter and chasing people away. And he said, but it seemed to me that what was needed that day was a gesture of respect. And so that was the gesture I could conceive of. It was beautiful, beautiful tale, beautiful story. But what's really important about this story is that it didn't just stop there. Lieutenant Colonel Chris Hughes changed the way the Army now relates to dispersing crowds. They created a new protocol for it based on his experience. Warrior courage, balanced warrior courage. When I was coming up in Buddhist practice, there was a lot of talk about spiritual warriors. And there were a lot of battlefield images that were used to help us, like one was that there were 10,000 soldiers to the south and 10,000 soldiers to the north and 10,000 to the east and west. And it would be easier to defeat these armies than it would be to train your own mind, And honestly, I didn't relate so well to these warrior images. I found them difficult, and they didn't seem to serve people I knew who were living with wounds of self-hatred or self-judgment. Yet also, it is important actually in our practice to have a certain kind of warrior courage. We need it. We need it to face powerful coercive forces that we experience in our practice, to change destructive patterns, to relax, the momentum of those patterns. I like what my old friend, Roshi's old friend too, Jack Cornfield, has to say on the subject. He said, true Dharma practice is a revolutionary activity, and you can't do it in a comfortable way. You have to challenge the whole identity of your life. And the strength that's asked for is not necessarily the strength of eliminating the impurities of the body or the mind, or fighting against defilements like greed, hatred, and delusion, or other inner corruptions. The strength that's needed is the courage of heart to remain undefended and open, and to be willing to touch the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows from a place of compassion, from the deepest place in our being. This is a different kind of fearlessness, I think, one that requires just as much passion and fire. And so that brings me to the second type of courage that I want to speak about, which is courage of heart. You know, when that strength in the belly that I spoke about a minute ago emerges up into the heart, it activates a kind of fearless receptivity, which I think is a capacity to meet whatever is in front of us, including our fear. We need to be strong of heart, lion-hearted in our dedication to know the truth. And I think this dedication comes from love of the truth. Because some part of us knows that we're never going to be fully happy and whole until we're suffused with this truth. So this requires courage and a boldness and a willingness to sacrifice what's false in us. You know, I recently participated in a Jukai ceremony, a lay ordination, where you sew a small Buddhist robe and you take vows and are given a new Dharma name. And my friend Norman said, this ritual is very beautiful, taking the Bodhisattva vows, but it's also a little sad. He said, because you're giving up your familiar self. Then he said, but it's okay because your familiar self is going to cause you a lot of suffering anyway. So in my life as a social activist, I found that I have to be willing to face doubt and fear and a sense of inadequacy and other hindrances in my life. And not just endure them, you know, not just tough them out, but open to them completely. Even if they challenge my most loved and cherished views. The strength of heart, it works in combination with the compassion in the heart that allows us to include everything that we want to avoid. I have a dear friend and student, her name is Janet. And one day they were having a backyard barbecue. She and her husband and their best friend, Alberto, and their children. And while the barbecue was going on, the kids went out in the front yard to play. They were in the backyard. And while they were in the backyard, Janet just had an inkling, some sense, you know, and she said, I think I want to go check on the kids. And their husband said, no, come on, just stay with us, you know, have another beer, relax with us. Janet said, no, I'm going to go check on the kids. And as she did, Alberto's son came running through the house past her. And she heard this incredible sound, you know, this crash on the street. And she went running out onto the street to find her son Jack lying in the road. And a car had hit him and drove off. And so quickly she screamed for help, and the husband came and they loaded Jack and Alberto into the pickup truck and they drove to the hospital. And Janet was in a kind of shock. All she could see was that Jack's leg was broken, and she felt horrible about it and guilty about it. But what she didn't realize is that Albert was doing CPR on Jack, you know, trying to help him breathe again. And they got to the hospital and they hooked Jack up to life support. And they all worked really hard for a long period of time. And then it became clear that Jack wasn't going to survive this. And so they unhooked him from life support. And Janet and her husband, they scooped up Jack and they put him in the pickup truck and they drove home with him. And along the way, they drove along a river. The road kind of hugged a river, and there was a big full moon out that night. And Janet said a kind of inner guidance spoke to her. And it said to her, if I'm ever going to honor Jack's life, I cannot let this accident destroy me. And they got home and Later that night, the police called to confirm that it was a hit and run and that the driver had turned himself in and that he would be charged. And, rage just ripped through Janet, through her body and mind, It was fierce. And the next morning she woke and they had breakfast and there was a knock on the door. And she opened the door, and through the screen door, she could see a man that she intuitively, instinctively knew was the driver who'd hit Jack. And she said that the anguish on his face opened her heart. And I think of the Longfellow quote that, reads, "If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all of our hostility." And this grieving mom, she invited the hit and run driver into her living room. And they sat on the couch, and the driver assumed all responsibility. He said, "I take full responsibility for this." He said, "I didn't know I'd hit Jack. I was driving to my daughter's wedding rehearsal, and I was late. And I was trying to get there on time, and I really didn't even know that I'd hit him until I got home and I saw blood on the fender. And then I remembered there was a sound." And he said, "I'm so sorry, and I take complete responsibility. I'll do anything at all, to help." And Janet said that her inner guidance spoke to her again at that moment, like it had along the river, And she said to this man, "The responsibility for Jack's death rests with all four of us adults." She said Jack's death was a result of a moment of inattention. It took a long time for Janet to heal her grief. Neighbors helped. A basket of eggs would appear on her doorstep, or, a bouquet of flowers. Janet's marriage didn't survive the death of her son, but Janet did. And, in that community where she lives, she's the person the community calls, the neighbors call when there's a child that's dying, and she's become one of the most amazing hospice caregivers that I know. Look, we like simple causes. They tidy up life's uncertainties. We want such accidents to be brought under human control. We want someone to be held accountable. Someone should be responsible. We want the outrageous and the impossible to be understood, to alleviate our own sense of helplessness. But life doesn't always present itself in ways that are right and reasonable. The truth is that we're rarely in control of such catastrophes, maybe especially the moment of our own dying. Bodhisattvas are beings who have the fortitude to stand with suffering that might bring the rest of us to our knees. Ordinary people with courageous presence into practice in small and beautiful ways every single day. There's a third quality of courage that I want to bring forward, and that's the courage of vulnerability. Taking a deep dive into vulnerability, it shows us how to become receptive to our deeper nature, our Buddha nature, And as it does, we come to know through wisdom, and we come to know our wisdom rather, and boundless compassion and the truth of our inseparability. The courage to love requires vulnerability, doesn't it? Is there a more vulnerable state than being in love? It's full of risk. It's full of uncertainty, of intensity and intimacy and conflict and truth-telling. Being vulnerable means we're sensitive, impressionable, more receptive to others and to our own inner guidance, as Janet was. We recognize the illusion of control and the reality of suffering, the truth of suffering. And we're invited to release the tight grip of our hold on the inexplicable and the unpredictable. I think the courage of vulnerability opens the door. It's a gate to invulnerability, the invulnerability of our most essential nature. I think our capacity to be vulnerable makes it possible for us to experience all levels of reality. And when we do, we feel permeable and recognize that our identities are not fixed and nothing in existence is permanent. And we see the emptiness of our compulsions and our fixations. Vulnerability introduces us to invulnerability. There's this famous old Buddhist story, and it's about a samurai who climbs this mountain to reach a small temple where there's a Buddhist monk sitting at the temple, as you can imagine. It's always like this in these Buddhist stories. And there he finds this calm monk sitting in zazen, and the samurai barks at him in a voice that he's accustomed to having obeyed. He says, "Monk, teach me about heaven and hell." The monk looks up at this samurai warrior and he answers with kind of disdain, "Teach you about heaven and hell? I couldn't teach you about anything. You're ignorant and dirty and a disgrace to your samurai class. Get out of my sight." And the samurai, of course, gets furious and overwhelmed with rage. He pulls out his sword and he's prepared to slay the monk. Looking straight into the samurai's eyes, the monk says, "That's hell." And the samurai froze for a moment, and recognizing the compassion of the monk who was willing to allow himself to be killed in order to teach the samurai a lesson, the warrior sheathed his sword and bowed. And the monk said softly, "And that's heaven." Fearlessness, at least in my mind, is not about eliminating or ignoring or pushing fear away. It's about developing the capacity to be compassionately present with our most difficult states, our most terrifying states. Undefended, vulnerable, we're open to it all. And paradoxically, the courage of vulnerability, it brings us to rest in non-defensiveness and opens us to our ultimate invulnerability. But this invulnerability that I'm speaking of, it's not stoicism. In our culture, invulnerability usually applies some stance or emotional stance, at least, against danger, like seeing ourselves as impenetrable, like we did when we were teenagers, But the invulnerability of our nature is pure openness. It's undefended spaciousness. In a way, it's true innocence, in which we step back, and we allow the winds of fear to blow right through us. There's no place for the fear to stick. There's no ground for it to land on. So we can drop the struggle, we can relax all of our unnecessary effort, and we can rest in a kind of defenselessness. Fear subsides and we become open to other possibilities, other capacities of our human existence, to deeper dimensions of what it means to be human. My friend Jack Cornfield, he told me a wonderful story over dinner one night. he said that he was, oh, I should be careful of time, shouldn't I? Sorry, I'm okay. Anyway, Jack told me this story, which I'll share with you as briefly as I can. And he used to teach these men's retreats in Northern California with Michael Meade and a few other wonderful teachers. And at these retreats, men would come, all men from all stratas of society, but in particular, there'd be two groups of men that would come. One was vets coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and gang kids coming from Compton and East LA and Oakland. And they'd all get together and they'd spend a week in the woods. And in one of these nights, in this big room, kind of a big meeting room, log construction, all lit with candles, Michael Meade, the storyteller, was telling a story. And these nights when Michael would speak, people would come out and bear witness. They would share their stories, and others would bear witness. And so Michael started to tell this story about this Irish warrior, wild, crazy guy, face painted, mad warrior, and how in the story the warrior goes out to meet a marauding force, and he defeats them. But he's so overcome with rage and fury and anger that he turns on his own village and comes back to his own village in this uncontrollable rage. And word of this happening comes to the village, and no one knows what to do. So they go to the elders, and the elders in this village are women. And the women say, okay, prepare a big barrel of water, of warm water, and get some ropes, and have all the women go to the edge of the village and stand bare-breasted. And so this is what they did. And when the warrior comes back full of his rage, ready to turn on his own village, he's startled first by all the women standing at the edge of the village. And so then they throw ropes around him and they capture him and they immerse him in warm water. And then all the women, all the elders gather around him and they sing him the song from his childhood as a way of returning him back to his own soul. They sing him the songs of his childhood. That's the story. And Michael's beating his drum and he's telling him the story. And then he opens it up for the room to speak. And, all kinds of stories come out. But, one story that comes out is this gang kid from Compton. And he comes out into the middle of the floor and he tells the story of walking home one day. And he was walking home with his homies and, car comes rolling down the street and the windows come down and the guns come out and bullets start flying. And he ducks behind a dumpster, but his friend, his best friend doesn't make it, and he gets shot. And this kid's telling this story. This kid's like 16, 17 years old, and he's telling this story about his friend and how he sees his friend lying, there, and he can't get to him. And one of these soldiers, one of the elders, he's 22. He comes out, and these vets are like gods to these kids coming from Compton. They're like gods. They're all tatted up and strong. And he comes out into the room and he says, you did the right thing. You didn't leave your buddy. You didn't leave your man. And then there's this vet, and he's standing in the middle of the room with this young kid, young gang kid, and all of a sudden, all the men in the room start singing. But they start singing to remind these two men of their souls. God, what are we doing to our young men? What are we doing to our young men? To be human is more than being born and getting a good education or finding the right partner, or getting a good job, or a pretty house on a nice street, just so you can get up and go to work and do it all over again. I think it's an invitation to feel everything, to come into direct contact with this strange and beautiful and horrible and perfectly ordinary thing we call life. It's to recognize the truth that there are babies like my granddaughter, who was born into loving arms and whose mother kisses a bright future into her cheeks every single day. And there are babies in Syrian refugee camps that are crying all night long. There are children born into loving arms, and there's infants like my friend Carolyn, who when she was a baby, her parents left her in a dumpster. There's kids making tents out of couch pillows and sheets, and there's kids weeping themselves to sleep in Syrian refugee camps. There's teenagers being shot in our schools. And there are others speaking truth to power. There's devastation and there's hopelessness, and there's the passion and the holy commitment to create a better future for all of us. And there's me speaking and you listening, and this sense of separation that might be here between us. And then there's unity, almost immediately, when we're reminded that there's love. Being loved helps us be strong. Loving helps us to become courageous. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. And thank you, Kozan, for your kind hosting of this.